Greetings, scholars. The first thing I want to tell you today is that today we are going to be covering some truly fun material. Of course, you're probably already thinking to yourself that I have a pretty twisted idea of what constitutes fun, but I'm hoping that you'll see that today's topic really is something engaging and interesting, and that is using sources effectively. That probably sounds pretty dry at first, but I think as we get into this, you'll see why it is so important. Once you have compiled your sources and explored your topic from different or even opposing viewpoints, you are ready to start using that information in your writing. But where to start? When you're looking at a huge stack of books or other source materials and trying to decide how to use them, the task can very quickly seem daunting. Today, we will talk about how to make that process a little bit easier, and we'll also talk about what you need to remember when incorporating those sources into your writing. Our first note for today is that after researching your topic and allowing that research to help you decide what your stance is, you want to go through your writing process and first develop an outline of your essay, and then second, let that outline guide the source material that you use and the way that you use it. This is helpful because it will allow you to see what direction your writing is going to take before you start incorporating the sources. In turn, that is going to make it easier to decide what material you are going to take from your sources and put into your writing. Let me show you an example. I'll choose a nice, boring, cliched topic for you so that I can leave all the fun topics for you to work with. And I'm going to work with gun control. Hopefully I'm going to do my research on the topic first before I just choose a stance. If I don't let my research guide me first, then I'm probably going to come up with some kind of uneducated and oversimplified thesis or stance like gun controls for wimps and communists, or guns are bad because they shoot people. Instead, I'm going to do my research first, and after giving myself a well-rounded education about the issue, I'm going to develop my thesis. My thesis for our example will be gun control laws that allow government to create registries and deny citizens conceal and carry rights contribute to greater gun violence in the long run. My topic sentences will tie into that thesis and help me establish the flow of my writing. Take a look at my topic sentences. The first one is, in the wake of tragedy, increased skepticism is common regarding the wisdom of a laissez-faire approach to gun control. My next topic sentence will read as follows. Although this skepticism is critical to the health of a democratic society, the idea of giving the government the power to create gun registries or restrict our right to conceal and carry a weapon has proven foolish time and time again throughout history. Now that I have constructed my outline, I'm going to have a much better idea of what kind of information will be most useful in my writing. One of the most common mistakes that writers make is that they don't follow this writing process, and when they reach for their sources, they just end up throwing in a weak quote that they found on page 2 when they flipped open the book, so that they can say they cited something. I understand that many writers might see the work of poring over a source as tedious, but it is important that the source fits well with your argument. If not, the argument will be sloppy and poorly supported, and you're just wasting your time at that point. So, in coming back to my thesis and topic sentences, I can see in that first topic sentence that I am bringing in some opposing viewpoints. That suggests to me that it would be helpful to find a few brief quotes from my opponents so I can prove to my reader that I'm not putting words in my opponent's mouth. These will be great sources. It's going to help me lay out what does the opposition say. That second topic sentence, however, appears to be trying to do something different. Notice how it transitions to a refutation of my opponent's argument, and it mentions that history has proven my opponent's viewpoint to be wrong. This is a good indicator to me that I should be digging not for quotes that my opponents might have about gun control, but instead I should be digging for statistical data and historical examples in my sources for this paragraph. Maybe I'll find some information about how crime rates are typically higher in cities that have stronger conceal and carry restrictions, and maybe I'll cite historical examples about nations that have created gun registries and what has come as a follow-up step to those registries in the past. Let's pause for some practice. I'm sure that by this time you have at least started researching your topic of choice. Now I would like you to take some time to open up the sources that you have compiled so that you can let it guide you to a strong thesis and topic sentences. After doing that, I would like you to consider what kind of source material would best fit into those paragraphs as support. I know this exercise may take a little more time than what we typically use for our exercises, but trust me, this will be worth it in the long run. So please pause the video at this time to complete these tasks. Alright, now we have identified the information we want to use to support our thesis and topic sentences, but we're facing a new obstacle. We need to use those sources properly, or else they will make our writing awkward, confusing, and maybe something even worse. So our third goal for this week is to introduce your sources effectively. I like to compare introducing your sources to introducing a friend. Think of what it would be like to bring a friend to a party where that person knew no one at the party, but you knew everybody. If you fail to introduce that friend, then you are likely to make everyone uncomfortable and awkward around that person. They'll be looking at them and thinking, where'd she come from? Who's this guy? What are they all about? Who's the creepster in the corner? The same thing is true of your sources. Think of them as your friend, and remember that your goal is for your reader to feel comfortable with your sources and feel that the sources are credible. In order to do that, a simple introduction can go a long way. Look at the following example of a source that was not introduced. See that? See how ugly that is? Notice how that quote just seems to pop up out of nowhere and it seems totally out of place? Yick. Now, watch as I change things up so that I can effectively introduce that source instead. Bippity boppity introduction! See there? See how much more smoothly that flows together now? Can you also notice that the source seems more reliable now, since you can tell who it came from? There are different ways to introduce a source smoothly, but the key thing is that you note who the creator of the source is and that you give the reader an idea of what makes that creator credible. Take a look at a couple more examples of some smooth but differently formatted source introductions. Always be sure to introduce your source. In fact, if you don't, you are committing a cardinal writing sin known as plagiarism. Trust me, you do not want to be a plagiarizer. I really can't stress that enough. Even though I kind of said that in a funny way, plagiarism is a very serious issue, and it can be done accidentally. So be certain that you do not become an accidental plagiarizer, because it doesn't really matter what the intent was. All that matters is the crime itself. So do not plagiarize. Always introduce your source. Give them credit. Alright, now let's go ahead and try that as well with a couple practice sources. Pause the video and write out 2 example source introductions like the ones that you have seen here. Got the hang of it? Well, I'm going to have to assume that you do, since you can't actually tell me anything through this video. So let's move on to our next point. Sources should also be cited within the text of your writing. This is helpful for the reader because an in-text citation helps the reader see how each source connects to the citations on your Works Cited page. That way, if they want to refer to that source themselves and learn more about what you're discussing, they can do so easily. Creating an in-text citation really isn't very difficult. You just need to put some parentheses at the end of the sentence in which you used your source and include the source author's last name and the page number where you got the source data from. Here's another example for you. Let's say that I pull up a Sports Illustrated article about baseball and get a good quote from it. I need to find the author of the article. In this case, it's Tom Verducci, who is a well-known sports writer. And I'm also going to include after his last name, a comma, and the page number. And in this case, that's page 38 that I got it from. As a result, my completed in-text source citation and introduction would look something like this. If you're dealing with a non-print source, such as a video interview or web article, you can still cite it in the text. You can just provide the author's last name inside the parentheses. The next question that people tend to ask me about citing a source is, well, what if I don't know the author? Well, the answer there is very clear. Then it's not a credible source. Don't use it. If you don't know where that information came from or who created it, then you have no way to prove that it's worth your reader listening to. It might be a bunch of baloney for all they know. So don't use it unless it's a credible source and you can cite a credible person who put it together. Now I know this is kind of a lot for this week, and I hope it's not too intimidating for you, but I do have a few additional pointers that I can provide you with, so I'm going to go ahead and do that too. I'd like to focus on making sure that you make good choices when it comes to using your sources in the form of summarizing information or quoting it. If you find yourself looking at a very long, wordy quote that you want to use but it expresses an important idea, you may be better served by summarizing it instead. So that's just putting it in your own words, briefly. Note that you're still using the source though, and you still need to cite it since you are taking someone else's material. But a summary is a fine way to condense big pieces of useful data or information into a more manageable size. If, however, you decide you're not going to summarize and you decide that you want to use a quote because it will be more helpful, there are a few pointers I can provide there as well. Okay, I've got some more tips for you here. This is all in addition to what we've already talked about. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with a lot in 1 week, but I think this stuff is still pretty simple, and you'll be able to take it in along with everything else we've already practiced with today. So if you decide to use quotations rather than just summarize or paraphrase a source, these are going to be some very useful tips for you when you use those quotations. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first one together here. Okay, every quotation should be relevant. You need to carefully consider exactly what you're trying to do with a quote before you use it. Don't just throw a quote in there so you can say, hey, I got a quote in there, awesome! Because that's not a good idea. That's not going to work out. You want to make sure that your quote is actually supporting the idea that you are trying to support. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example here. Notice I've got it titled Lousy Example. And it says, the president's job is one that regularly requires difficult decisions. As Barack Obama has said, the Constitution must be upheld. It is a document that we must not allow to be trampled upon or misconstrued. Those decisions often require sacrifice and compromise, and they are rarely win-win situations. What's wrong with this quote? Take a look at it. Well, we can see that the topic sentence that topic sentence is talking about difficult decisions, but the quote doesn't really bring up any difficult decisions. It's talking about an issue of upholding the Constitution. So here we have a quote that doesn't really even fit with what's trying to be proven and supported here. So avoid situations like that. Make sure your quotes are always supporting your topic sentence, the main idea that you're bringing up in each paragraph. Okay, next, you don't want to be too brief with your quotations. If you are going to take the time to quote something, you may as well make it worth the reader's while. Don't just throw something so short in there that it can't really say a whole lot, or you can't really have much to expand upon with some commentary. So here's another not so good example. It says, the insurgents do not recognize Vladimir Putin's claims on their land. They're invalid, said one rebel of Putin's claims that the Ukraine belongs under Russian authority. Look at that. 2 words, that's it. You can't really expound upon that and dig into the depths of the meaning here of this quote. It's just too short. It's too brief. So, and it's not really saying anything about the quote afterwards either. So just make sure you're using a quote that's worth the reader's time and your time. Okay, next. Don't use more of a quote than is necessary. This is very easy. This is a very easy mistake to make. Sometimes you'll find just like a whole paragraph that you just love. And I mean, you'll even see, if you read some books, you'll find situations where large chunks of text might be quoted, but for the kind of essays we're writing, they're rather brief. You're probably not going to go over 6 pages or so, and as a result, you're probably not going to be digging deep enough into a topic to need a quote that big. So my suggestion is, make sure that the quote doesn't take over. Don't let it be like a weed in the garden. So doing that will cause your message to be lost and your point to become unclear. Don't let the quote drive your essay around. You want to use the quote, so don't let it turn you into the tool. You use the quote as the tool instead. Okay. It's also a good idea, if you're going to quote both opposing and agreeing sources. I know that it's easy to look at that at a source and say, oh, well, this one agrees with me, I want to stick that in there. I recommend that you do that, but make sure that you give your opponents credit too. And if you can even cite them and say, hey, look, here's what my opponent says, you're going to be setting yourself up much better to, you've already set yourself up to show that you're not biased, that you're being fair. And it's also going to set you up better to argue against those opposing viewpoints. So don't be afraid to quote an opposing viewpoint. All right. You also don't want to quote the same source repetitively. You want to try and keep it varied. If you don't, as I already wrote here, this will hurt the credibility of your argument because it suggests that you haven't done adequate research. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. You want to show that you have taken the time to get to know your issue well and that you have a well-rounded understanding of it. And if you're quoting the same source over and over, your reader's going to think, even if it's not the case, they'll still think, this person really hasn't dug very deep. They haven't done their homework. They just have one source here. So this also leads to mind-numbing summarizing of the source's points instead of an active dialogue of ideas, which is what we're going for, that active dialogue. Here's one. LeBron James said that I'm glad to be back in Cleveland. He also noted that my goal is to bring a championship ring to my home state. Another thing he said was, etc., etc. This one's pretty list-like, but you get the picture. Don't overuse and abuse one source. Okay, and also have some commentary about each quote. Don't just leave it hanging there. The point of bringing in a quote is to analyze it and say, what has this quote shown us for the reader? So here's an example that does not have any analysis behind it. It says, Ron Paul's stance on drugs, including deadly narcotics like heroin, is unique among his political rivals. I say, why not legalize them? The price we pay in the form of violent civilian deaths by drug cartels on the street, police raids, and the enormous tax burden are not worth it. Okay, well, this person has quoted Ron Paul, but they need to make some commentary. Whether they agree with that stance or disagree with it, they need to make some clarification of what they think about that quote. Is it an accurate statement? Is he missing something here? What do they think? So don't leave the quote by itself. Make it do something. Use it. Say something about it. And then lastly, we've already kind of talked about this one, but I just want to re-emphasize it. Make sure you incorporate quotes smoothly. So don't just make them pop out at your reader like a jack-in-the-box, because that nobody likes to be, confused by what they're seeing like that. So just make sure it works in smoothly. Here's a good example for us. Finally, a good example, right? Okay, it says, although Friedrich Hayek believed that the free market granted, and look how smooth that quote goes in there, granted greater efficiency in supplying society with the immeasurably complex mix of each individual's wants and needs, he also conceded that the free market system, and any other system for that matter, is going to be flawed. Okay, so that's a good example. They managed to work, I'm going to point here, managed to work that quote in smoothly with what they were saying themselves. So here we have them making their comment, and then boom, there's that. This is actually more like a, it could be like something like a topic sentence, and they could expound on that quote and say some more in the rest of the paragraph. So these are some more tips for you, and I hope they've been helpful. There you have it, everybody, using a source effectively.